Welcome to episode 1 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. This episode was recorded in the wilds of Connecticut on January 21st, 2019. Today I'd like to introduce you to myself, the format of the podcast, and talk about a few things that are on my mind about knitting and yarn and whatever all else we get to this time. I'll save contact information for the end of the podcast, but just know that I would love to hear from you, so please take the time to contact me if you feel so moved. I'm sitting here in my office recording this the day after our first major snowstorm of the year. We had some snow very early in the year that stuck for a week or so, and then nothing since, so we really are overdue, but I would prefer that it not be the 6 inches of snow and ice that fell on us. My family and I moved to Connecticut after over 8 years of living in the Philippines and 9 years living in Arizona, so even though I grew up in a small town in western Massachusetts, I am not used to the cold weather anymore. We moved to the area last year during the coldest part of the coldest winter this area has had in a very long time, and even that was not enough to get me back into the New Englander mindset about winter. I am suffering. Growing up in New England, I was taught to crochet and then knit out of necessity. We lived in sweaters, and the household thermostat was never set higher than 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was only when we had company over. So we spent a good portion of the year swathed in afghans we made for ourselves, and my mother set me up with a steady stream of sweaters she'd knit me out of the Mary Maxim catalog with cats and puppies across the front. Sounds cute, but I was in middle school at the time. I had a legit ugly Christmas sweater with a tree with working Christmas lights on it in 1989. Eventually, my mother discovered sock knitting, and my wintertime wardrobe came to include custom knit wool socks to go with the hats, scarves, mittens, and sweaters with kitty cats that my mother had already made me. All I needed was a pair of knit pants, and my collection would have been complete. Now I can afford to keep the house warmer, but I still opt to keep my feet in the custom knit wool socks made for me by my mother 20 years ago. And I can do that because she knit me a lot of them. And they sat in a drawer for almost 20 years while I lived places where winter meant it might dip below 70 degrees Fahrenheit at night. I myself was a reluctant knitter. I didn't really pick it up with a passion until I was in my 20s. I much preferred crochet as a child because the results were quicker and it seemed far less complicated to me. On January 1st of this year, I did something I've been thinking about doing for a few years now and signed up for the Knitting Guild Association's Master Hand Knitter program. It's a 3-level program that takes about 5 years to do if you do it at the recommended pace. It's meant to take you from an intermediate knitter to a master of the craft. It's mostly self-taught, but over the years, Guild members have written articles that address the main points you need to research. Between those articles, access to a good library, and YouTube, you can find everything you need to know for the program. So it is doable, and if it's something you've been thinking about, I encourage you to give it a go. I plan to use this podcast as a channel to talk about the things I learn as I move through the program. I've been knitting for 20 years now, but still, the first week of research has filled in so many gaps in my knowledge of knitting and yarn that I didn't even know were there. But this project of mine to become a master knitter is starting as a very difficult year comes to a close. In the last 13 months, I moved my family back to the US after spending over 8 years overseas. My mother died, a father-in-law died, an aunt died. As we moved back, we began to make friends, and almost every one of those first friends ended up moving, so we constantly felt like we were starting over. It has been hard, and it's been a time of reflection and humility, and feeling like maybe I don't have this all figured out, and coming to terms with that. So this podcast is not just about knitting, it will be about life, and those lessons that come our way when we sometimes don't expect them or want them. But mostly it will be about knitting. After this first break, we'll get to some of that knitting stuff. For now, I'm going to have a sip of my herbal tea and pick up my needles while we listen to the song from Dr. Turtle, available from Free Music Archive, called Dead from the Beginning, Alive Till the End. If you are an indie artist and would like to give permission for me to use a song of yours on the show, please send me an email at ann@familypodcast.com and we'll discuss. For now, here's Dr. Turtle. I have this memory of a yarn shop. I remember going to it with my mother for the first time because it was located in a house. And I think I was probably 6 or 7 years old the first time she took me to it, and it just blew my young mind that people could have stores in their homes. Of course, people have always had stores in their homes, but to my inexperienced mind, stores belonged in the mall or the brick buildings of the main street in town, not on the other side of someone's kitchen door. I remember this shop as being extremely orderly. There were bookshelves along the walls and a strip of them through the center of the room, and that was about it. All the yarn was on the shelves and the books were on the shelves, and I was cautioned by my mother not to touch anything in the store at all. So I mostly stood by the entry door and tried to stay out of the way as best I could. But I loved the hand-knit sweaters hanging around the edge of the room from the ceiling, and I remember the buzz of the women in the shop. It may have only been 3 or 4 ladies there at any given time, but the shop was so small it seemed like there was always a crowd. I mention this memory because I would like to tell you about my current yarn store, and it taps into this first experience of mine. Only in this case, the home is a much older New England-style house with the ever-so-delightful collapsible cup-style additions at the back. That's how I think of them anyway. The builders of yore in New England built themselves homes that would work for them at the time, and then as families grew or needs changed, they would add on to one side of the house. Only the addition was rarely as tall as the original building. I don't know if they just knew that trying to match the new roof to old construction was a recipe for leaks, or if they were trying to save on materials or what, but the addition seemed to always be a little shorter and a little narrower. And then if needs changed again, the new addition onto the addition would again be a little shorter and a little narrower, and to me those houses look like little collapsible cups turned on their sides, and I like to imagine that when it's time to move, the owners can just push all the additions into the original structure and pack the home along with them. But that's neither here nor there. Margie's Yarn Crafts in Granby, Connecticut is my current local yarn store, and it's located in one of those delightful collapsible cup homes with the house in the front, the store in the middle, and a classroom in the back. Only rather than the crisp orderliness of my very first local yarn store, Margie's shop is like walking into a wise woman's house, or a healer's den. Only instead of herbs drying from the ceiling, there are project bags hanging for sale, and there's an antique desk topped with copies of Vogue knitting and specialty yarns instead of notebooks full of remedies. Rather than baskets of dried mushrooms, there are baskets full of skeins of yarn from smaller makers. Right next to the door is a display of buttons from floor to ceiling that catch your eye like wind chimes. Not an inch of space is unused in this store, but it doesn't feel oppressive at all. All the space is widely used. For instance, rather than losing a wall to a display of knitting needles and crochet hooks and other notions, all of them are contained within a couple of dressers. You go through the drawers to find what you need, which leaves so much more room for the yarn, and let's face it, that's what we all love about our local yarn shops. Yes, we live in a time when we can order anything online, including yarn, but there is nothing like lingering in the yarn shop to test out different color combinations, or think about substituting for a yarn that would offer more drape or easier care. If you have friends who knit and want to pick up some gifts for them, Margie has a selection of lovely ideas that fall into the category of things I'd love to own but would never buy for myself, including adorable polymer clay stitch markers, a yarn bowl that is actually a box shape and has a needle gauge built into the side, and a lot more. So much more. I am very, very tempted by her counter items every time I'm in the shop. The greatest thing about the shop, though, is Margie herself, who is generous with her expertise. I have been in the shop before, and I've heard Margie deal with a string of questions from her customers with what is apparently an inner knitting encyclopedia. And the one time I heard her not have the answer, she knew exactly who to put the person in contact with. She has been in this business for 30 years now and knows her stuff. The back room is where project and technique classes take place on weekends and evenings. And again, I've been in the shop before while the classes have been going on, and her instructors are encouraging and informative. I chose the image of a healer's den for a reason. Margie's Yarn Crafts is one of those shops you can go into to buy the thing you need, yes, but it also is just such a cozy, inspiring, welcoming place that I always leave feeling like my day has been made better. I have lived all over the world since I first walked into that yarn store with my mother all those years ago. I have been in dozens of stores from Tokyo to Paris to Lima to San Francisco, but there is just something that feels so right about having an owner-run yarn shop attached to a home. I just love Margie's Yarn Crafts. If you ever find yourself near Granby, Connecticut, it is worth making the trip over to visit the shop. I would like to tell you about something I picked up the last time I was in Margie's. I've been using a pencil case to hold my notions in my knitting bag for the last 10 years or so, and it is starting to look a little ragged. It's one of those bags that is the shape of a cylinder with a zipper along one side. And I have loved this little case because it holds a lot, and the design on the outside is really cute, but it's also hard to see all my stuff because the opening is a little restrictive and everything is just in one large pile, so I usually end up running my fingers through everything until I can feel what I'm looking for. I have been putting off getting a new Notions bag because, again, this one's really cute, even if it's not ideal. But when I was in Margie's the other day, I saw a 2-pocket mini My Baggie mesh pouch, and I realized that it was an ideal pouch for what I need. It's actually got 2 compartments, so I can sort the things out a bit. It's mesh, so I can see where things are in the bag. But I didn't realize how much I was going to love it until I got it home, because I thought it was one pouch with 2 compartments, but it's actually 2 pouches that are linked together with magnets on either end of the pouches. Now, why would that be so cool? Well, first of all, because the pouches separate from one another, I was able to sort through my notions and put the tools I need while I'm knitting in one, and the tools I need for finishing or for certain other points in a project in the other. So rather than having to carry all of my notions around with me when I'm going to be knitting on the go, I can grab one pouch or the other or both as needed. Also, a cool thing about the magnets is that my stitch markers and mini scissors stick to them. So it actually helps keep the stuff within the bag that much tidier. The magnets are strong enough to hold the bags together even if I give them a good shake. Like, I have it here with me. I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm actually trying to shake them apart right now, and they will not come apart. But when I need to separate them, it's not difficult at all. I can pull them apart with one hand if I need to. I love products like this where you can tell some thought went into them, and they solve problems you didn't even realize you had, but they still maintain a very simple look. So that's what's making me happy in my knitting bag this week. If you can't find them in your local yarn store, you can Google My Baggie, spelled M-Y-B-A-G-G-E-E, and there are plenty of online retailers carrying them. I got mine on sale for a little over $8 at Margie's Yarn Crafts in Granby, Connecticut. Here's another song for you. This one is also from the Free Music Archive. It's Main Square from the album #Handmade by Jazar. Pick up your needles and knit a bit with me if you aren't already, and I'll talk to you on the other side. As I said, I'm a recent enrollee in the Knitting Guild Association's Master Hand Knitter program. I'm in level 1, which is meant to take 1 year to complete. I have to do a 10-page report about blocking and the care of knit items, complete with extensive footnotes. I feel like if I had to, I could explain the basics of caring for most of the main fiber types used in yarn in about 3 minutes. So the thought of producing a 10-page paper on the topic was a little daunting. And then I began my research. Who would have thought the concept of blocking could be so controversial? I have found mainstream sources who eschew the idea of blocking altogether, stressing that if you knit properly, your garment shouldn't need it, and sources that say you're basically a neglectful parent if you don't pin each piece out meticulously and allow it to dry under the precise conditions. So, needless to say, I'm learning a lot that I didn't know when it comes to blocking. In the past, I have relied almost exclusively on steam blocking. I knew about wet blocking, where you wet the item thoroughly, press most of the water out, and then pin it into shape and allow it to dry, but that seemed like such a hassle. I have only done it a few times in my life. But the other day, I sat down to block my preliminary swatch, and I could not get it to behave properly. The preliminary swatch is done by taking the yarn you intend to use for all the swatches in the program that you will do in level 1, and knitting 2.5 inches in stockinette stitch with each of 3 needle sizes. This gives you a starting place swatch to analyze, to find the areas you need to improve, and it also helps you pick which needle size will be ideal for the remainder of your swatches. However, the instructions for the swatch do not allow you to begin or end with garter stitch rows, so of course the swatch rolls in on itself when it's done. I thought I would be a good little master knitter candidate and do a proper wet block on this swatch, because surely that would be the best way to get it to not roll. And I did get the swatch to lie mostly flat. After wet blocking it and allowing it to dry completely, I unpinned the swatch and the sides no longer rolled, but the bottom and top still rolled back toward the knit side of the fabric. Drat. Rather than wet blocking it again, I decided to try another method I'd read about as I took notes on the paper. I laid the piece out, knit side down, being careful to pull the curled ends into their proper position. Then I laid a wet cotton hand towel on top of it. With the iron on the hottest setting, I gently placed it on top of the towel without mashing it down at all, just putting it in contact with the towel. What this did was create a blast of steam that shot directly into the swatch below. After moving the iron to a few different positions, the towel was almost completely dry, so I left the towel in place on top of the swatch overnight and checked on it in the morning. By that time, everything was dry, and that pesky top and bottom roll was completely gone. I thought I knew how to knit. I've been doing this for over 20 years, but I'm still learning, and I'm looking forward to sharing what I learned with you along the way. Running a podcast does cost money, so I will be including sponsors and affiliate links in my episodes to help defray the cost of production. I will never recommend anything that I have not used myself and feel that I can recommend with a clear conscience, and if something is an ad rather than a recommendation being made for no compensation, it will be surrounded by little audible stingers to signal that it is a commercial. So talking about Margie's and my baggie was just me sharing things that made me happy. That said, while the following involves an affiliate link, it's also something that makes me happy. I'd like to tell you about Drops. Drops is a detergent company that delivers right to your door. Their products are plant-based, free from dyes and fillers, and extra water. The detergent comes in single-use pods that you can just throw in your washing machine or dishwasher and call it good. I get 4 months worth of detergent shipped to me in one go. You might think that would require a huge box, but it all fits in a box smaller than 2 shoe boxes. And yes, it is shipped in recyclable cardboard packaging, not plastic. I love drops because I was constantly forgetting to buy detergent at the grocery store, and then the laundry pile would start to grow and grow unless I made a special trip to the store to get some. And laundry detergent is one of those things that if you don't have it, the chaos that ensues is shocking. Now my detergent comes to me 3 times a year, and I always have it when I need it. There are plans for singles, couples, and families, and you can alter the shipment size if you find you are ending up with too little. They have varieties with no fragrance added, which is what I love, and they also have fragrance booster packs if you really love scent on your clothing. They have laundry detergent, fabric softener pods, dishwasher pods, scent boosters, and more. They also have a hand wash and small load size pods, so you aren't wasting a whole pod to wash a sweater or 2. 1 pod cleans as well as 2 pods from one of the national leading brands, which shall remain nameless because the formula for the drops product is super concentrated. So the price per load is actually less than half of what I'd been paying to wash our clothes before. I tried them on a whim about 6 months ago and have been completely impressed with how well they clean, so check them out. Use my link in the show notes at ithoughtIknewhow.familypodcasts.com to get to their site. You'll get $10 off your first order for using my link, and I'll get a commission to help fund the show. We all win. A few more things today before I go. First, I'd like to share with you what is on my needles. I have mostly been working on what I'd call fairly mindless projects lately. Life, especially around the holidays, is busy and crazy and dynamic and mentally invasive. So any real energy I've had to put into my knitting has gone toward the Master Knitting program. And my personal knitting has been a lot of garter stitch and simple shapes and quick stockinette projects. So right now I'm working on a sister shawl to one I made earlier this year. Jimmy Bean's Wool has these really neat gift sets that are a vase with artfully arranged hanks of Madeline Tosh yarn and needles and a pattern in them rather than flowers. And for Mother's Day this year, my husband got me one with a deep maroon and 2 shades of gray. I made myself the Free Your Fade shawl pattern that came with it. It's a triangle-shaped shawl that starts at one of the side points and knits wider and wider until the cast-off edge forms both the bottom point and the other side point of the shawl. When I finished, I found that I had only used about half of the yarn provided. Each of the 3 colors had unequal amounts used, though. The maroon had the most left over and the lighter gray the least. I really could have just cast on and made another one with the colors going in the opposite direction, especially since I had wanted to make the maroon the main color, and without thinking I had cast on with it at the smallest end of the shawl. But instead I decided to find a different pattern, because while I like the shawl, I'm not in love with the shawl. It's one of those long asymmetrical triangles where the narrow points end up curling in on themselves. And that's fine because they end up tucked away when I wear it. But I really wanted something a little more symmetrical and triangle-y and in need of less blocking. So I dug around on Ravelry and found a fairly brainless drops pattern. It's their Loving Embrace pattern, and it's designed to be knit in an Aran weight yarn on size 11 needles, but the pattern is very simple and can really be done with any yarn on a needle that will give you a good closed fabric. I cast on using my Merino Light Madeline Tosh in Tianjin Pepper and some size 5 needles. Merino Light is a fingering weight yarn, so 5s may seem too big, but I am a very firm knitter, so I tend to need to go up a size or 2 from the recommended needles to get a nice drape. I have been knitting away at that for the past 3 weeks or so. It's a bottom-up pattern, so you start with the point of the shawl, and for 2 rows, you increase by doing a yarn over once at the beginning of the row after the first stitch. And for 2 rows, you yarn over once each at the beginning of the row after the first and second stitches. And that's the entire pattern. You just repeat those 4 rows. I have been knitting on this through movies, on car trips, wherever. It's something I can do completely by feel, and it's coming along quite nicely. I cast on with the maroon first, as it's the yarn I had the most of after knitting the Free Your Fade shawl. I finished the darker gray section last night and am continuing with the lighter gray. Each stripe of color is knitting up to be about a third of the length of the one before, just because each remnant from the original project is less than the one before, and of course the shawl is continuing to get wider as I go. It should be done and off the needles by the end of the week. It doesn't look like it will need any blocking at all, and after this stint with a truly mindless knit, I am going to be ready to turn some brain power to something more complicated again. And finally, I would just like to say that I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. I've been wanting to do a knitting podcast for years, ever since the time years ago when the mighty Brenda Dane ruled the knitting podverse with Cast On. It's still available out there wherever you find podcasts, so if you haven't listened to Cast On in the past, it's worth finding. I'd also like to give a shout out to Natalie of the Mastering the Knits podcast. She also podcasts about the Master Hand Knitter program, only she has actually finished level 1 already. So if you're itching to know more about the program, look her up at masteringthenitspodcast.com and as Bark and Knit on Instagram, where she is very encouraging to those of us who are coming through the program too. Thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you would like to contact me, you can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. I'm on Ravelry and Instagram as I Thought I Knew How. You may find me on other social media platforms under that name, but those are just placeholder accounts for now. I do have a website for the show at ithoughtiknewhow.familypodcasts.com. There you will find the show notes for each episode, including links to products I've mentioned and ways to support the show. Remember, you can help support the show by giving drops a try. Thank you for your support. If you are a musician or know one and would like to have a song featured on the program, drop me an email and point me to where I can hear your music. I have found some of my favorite songs ever through podcasts, so I'd love to be able to help other people find your music the same way. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.